Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Facebook Live event discussing domestic violence awareness. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, so this is a fitting conversation and a timely one, something we should always be keeping in mind, especially as we head to the polls and look to elect people who will work to end domestic violence and work to make people's lives better. So I'd like to welcome Jamie Mosser, candidate for Kane County State's Attorney. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, Martha, for having me and having this conversation. It's very important.
Thank you. And Cassandra Tanner Miller, who is a domestic violence survivor and the founder of Colton's Legacy. Welcome, Cassandra, and thank you for your courage in joining us in this conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So most people have an idea of what domestic violence is. And when we talk about it, I think it is important to start with a definition of domestic violence so that people have that understanding as we go into this conversation. So domestic violence is the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and/or other abusive behavior as part of a systemic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. It includes physical violence, sexual violence, threats, and emotional abuse. The frequency and severity of domestic violence can vary dramatically. Besides being the leading cause of injury to women in the United States, a woman is beaten every 15 seconds in this country. It is an issue of increasing concern because of its negative effect on all family members, especially children. So some basic statistics that are important to understand is that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men are victims of some form of domestic violence or intimate partner violence at some point in their life. And it takes an average of 7 incidents before a victim will reach out for help, either to authorities or to a friend or family member. So these are really important things to understand. There are often signs to watch for of domestic violence, things that family members and friends can be looking for, and things that people should be looking for in their own relationships if they think they might be a victim themselves. So Cassandra, I'm wondering from your experience, what signs you saw, when you were first realizing that this is what was happening to you in your life, and what made you worry for your own safety and the safety of your children?
Okay, so I talk about how domestic violence is a grooming process. It's not something that is very noticeable right away. It's something that slowly happens, but it's very individualized and it's very unique, like a snowflake. Not every single domestic violence case is identical to the next one. In my specific case, dating was a process through it where it was slow. Intimidation factors, more emotional and mental abuse, where it was controlling. Intimidation factors as far as, well, if you do this, then I'm going to do this in rebuttal. There was always a punishment, and it was not physical at that point. As it progressed and we got married, the punishment, because now I was carrying the same last name as that person and I was pregnant with a child, and that was Colton, it became more of a punishment of aggressive behavior through intimidation. And those warning signs to me were the breaking of objects, marital objects, because technically within Illinois limits and laws, it's not illegal for somebody to use intimidation factors as long as they don't put their hands on you. So that is something abusers will often use by breaking things around you to show you a level of control or abuse that they can get away with, by showing you how much damage they could actually do, but not physically doing it to you as a victim. It's a loophole that they've learned through their cycles of abuse of what they can and cannot do. So those warning signs for me, the biggest was when things around me started to break. I started to realize that holes in walls were eventually going to be physical attributes that were going to be put onto me. And by reaching out and not getting the proper help that I was supposed to have been receiving, because there is a fine line of what you can and cannot do, I realized that I had to get out of a domestic violence relationship because it was progressively getting worse, even if it stagnantly stayed where it's at. And that's where a lot of warning signs and people tend to stay, is because you think, okay, well, it's not getting worse today, but there is always that promise it will get worse, and it was not going to get better, and I had to get out because of that.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, do you have insight into the legal perspective on warning signs and services, things that are available to people who are seeing these warning signs?
Absolutely. A lot of times, as Cassandra said, the person that is the abuser doesn't come off as an abuser. Most of the time, you're not starting a relationship because somebody comes up to you and just automatically punches you in the face. That would be a person you would avoid. What we try to, when we go into the community to talk to people about, is this person, as Cassandra said, is grooming you. It's attention, it's love. And for most people, they think of this as that attentive behavior. Look at this person who's paying this much attention to me. He's noticing what I'm wearing. He knows who I'm calling, who I'm talking to. And then there's that spike of jealousy, which they don't really see as that controlling behavior. And then it becomes this cycle where there is an incident. That incident happens, and it doesn't always result in a physical abuse. And that's what a lot of people don't understand, is that it doesn't manifest itself in a punch or a push or a kick. Mm-hmm. After that physical, or after that incident, then there's this honeymoon period. And during that honeymoon period, that's when the promise is, I'm so sorry, I love you, I will never do this again, I'll get help. Then it starts to kind of break down, and that's where there's a lot of blaming. Well, if you hadn't have done this, then I wouldn't have done that. And then this is the tension building. And this is where the survivors start to understand that the violence is going to happen again at some point. And as the relationship goes on, that time period, that cycle that's going on just gets shorter and shorter. So what we tell people is, if you believe that someone is in an abusive relationship, there's a lot of things that you can do, including giving them information about our local shelters, Community Crisis Center in Elgin and Mutual Ground in Aurora, and also other services, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later, such as legal services. Most of these organizations have the ability for people to look at the website, but it automatically has an escape button that then erases the history. So the abuser who does check a person's history is going to look into to see what sites you're going to check. We do a lot of community awareness too, to try to get into businesses such as hairdressers. A lot of times an abuser won't actually go to the hairdresser with the victim in this case. And so we provide and have provided training to hairdressers to see signs of abuse, missing hair, maybe bumps or bruises, touching somebody and they shudder with pain. And then they can discreetly slip them information about domestic violence services in a place that's safe because the abuser's not there.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that about hairdressers. That's that's good to know that that's being done. So like you mentioned, Jamie, there are many different services that people can reach out to if they're growing concerned about themselves or a friend. So IDHS offers a hotline, and I think we're going to post that number in the chat for people to have know about. It's important to know. So the IDHS hotline number is 1-877-2END-DV. So that's the words to end DV, or it's 1-877-863-6338. They also have a TTY service, which is 1-877-863-6339. It's a free hotline. It's confidential, multilingual, and it's open 24 hours a day. There's also the United Way 211 service, which will connect people with any services. And we're actually doing a Facebook Live on Thursday about that. But even for domestic violence, 211 is an easy number to remember. You can call it and they will connect you to appropriate services for what you need. There's, like Jamie mentioned, the Community Crisis Center in Elgin. We'll post that number below. Mutual Ground of Aurora And then in McHenry, there's Turning Point. So these are all places that will give answers, provide services when appropriate, have shelter available for emergencies as well. So Cassandra, you mentioned when you were talking about your recognition that things were not going to get better and the need to escape, the need to get out. How, I mean, I can imagine that's an incredibly difficult decision to make. How did you come about making that decision, and what were the biggest struggles in making that decision? How did you overcome those struggles?
So when I left, I created a safety plan, which I encourage all victims to follow through on. When you are leaving, make sure that the abuser is not going to be anywhere within the area that you are fleeing from. He was actually at military drill for that weekend, and I had moved my children and myself out into my new home. I had loved ones there. I had notified police that I was moving out. But coming to that decision for a domestic violence victim is very difficult because, as statistics will show, within the first 72 hours of actually leaving an abuser, your risk of being killed by your abuser is raised significantly. Because at that point, your abuser is desperate, and with desperation comes violence, and it is violence that they know that they are losing control. It's actually the most time that we are in the most danger, and creating a safe exit, but also a safe plan around you consistently after that point is the key to having a successful escape from domestic violence, because your abuser at that point is going to try everything, that honeymooning, that pleading, that I'm going to change, I'm going to help, I'm never going to do this again, meet me somewhere. That is something I always tell victims to be very careful with when you actually do get out within that first time period. They'll tell, oh, meet me here. Or, oh, you forgot this at the house. Come meet me somewhere in a parking lot. Oh, come back to the house. Mm-hmm. If you go back there, your chances by being killed by them or seriously injured by that person is extremely high, mm-hmm. because emotions are very heightened in that moment, because you are in now this situation where you've now left and you're trying to figure out what your next steps are about changing and rewiring yourself from being a victim of domestic violence to a survivor of domestic violence. And that is like the most crucial point of where we should be helping victims out, but also where the abusers, they should be getting their own personal help in that situation too, to help some of the escalation of behaviors that are going to arise from both parties, thinking that they're going to change or there's a chance to get the person back. And mm-hmm. for me, when I left, I never returned. But reaching that was because I knew there was no going to get better. And he was escalating to a point that was going to put my children and I directly in harm's way. And I was not willing to risk that for my children's sake. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Jamie, what, in terms of victims leaving and the risk that is clearly still present, and what Cassandra just shared about the need for the abuser too to be getting, some attention for the risk that is involved. What legal options are available to victims at this point? What can be done to address the abuser at this point as well? What input do you have on this?
Sure. So one of the things that we really try to tell people who are in this situation is to somehow document the abuse that's happening, because that is something that is crucial in most domestic violence prosecutions at a later date. Because the unfortunate thing is, in our domestic violence world, people just don't believe victims in the way that they should. And it comes down to, as they say, a he said, she said type of an argument. So one of the things that we talk about is, if there are physical injury, take some photographs of that, but make sure to put it in a protected place so the abuser doesn't see what you're doing. There's a fantastic movement right now called the Evidentiary Abuse Affidavit, the EAE, I believe is what it is. And so it's under the Document the Abuse website, where the idea is they're developing an app that will look like nothing on a person's phone. But that's where this information is being stored. So you can put a date and something happened, punched a hole in the wall. Another date, shoved me to the ground. Another date, here are photographs of what happened. But obviously all of this has to be done in the safest possible way, because you do not want the abuser finding it and then that creates a more hostile situation. As Cassandra said, it has to be done with a plan before leaving, because you do want to make sure you're safe. A lot of the cases that I tried when I was at the state's attorney's office started with the victim trying to leave the home and trying to end the relationship, and that's when violence happened. There is a fantastic website that people can go to kind of get information on what a safety plan is. So that way they can really understand what steps to take in the process. And so that is under the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Domestic and Sexual Violence website. And again, we'll put all of this up for information, but it has a great checklist sheet to go through, including making sure that people know where you're going and where you're going to be. Mutual Ground and Crisis Center are our shelters that allow people to come and stay there with children. They do not prevent people from being there because of gender. So if there is a male victim, they're going to help that person as well. One of the things, especially during COVID times, that people need to understand is our shelters are not able to hold the same amount of people that we were able to beforehand. So prior to leaving or trying to go to a shelter, it is helpful to call them first to see what openings there are or what other resources might be available. The other thing, and the easiest sometimes for protection, is to get an order of protection or a civil no contact order. Those are the protective orders that we have in Illinois that prevent another person from having any contact or communication with you, or could potentially protect addresses. An order of protection is used anytime that there's some sort of family or household relationship. So that's dating, formally dating, married, formally married, or related by blood or marriage. And then there's any type of abuse. Abuse is not just limited to physical abuse. And this is what I want to make sure that people understand. There is verbal abuse. There is harassment. That falls under the definition of domestic violence in the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, and could be enough for you to get an order of protection as well. A civil no contact order is something that can be used for victims of sexual assault, whether or not they know their partner. It is the same mechanism as an order of protection, it just has a different allegation. Victims are able to apply for those. They can first start that online through our circuit clerk's office, our Kane County Circuit Clerk's office. They can put down the allegations of what happened and it gets sent to the court. It doesn't become an official document though until that person actually goes to the courthouse and finishes all of the information. At the Kane County Judicial Center, which is located in St. Charles, which is off of Route 38, we have a law library with some amazing people who work there who can help give guidance in regards to finishing the application. We also have law clerks who specifically work for our judges, and those individuals will help you finish the order of protection. And lastly, we have Prairie State Legal Services, which is our local not-for-profit legal aid agency that is specifically there to help victims of domestic violence and sexual assault cases. Pre-COVID, they were there for several days a week, making sure that they were able to meet with victims as they showed up to the courthouse. Now it's more by schedule, but you can find out when they're there by either going to the law library or to the website for Prairie State Legal Services. That is the best way to get protection after somebody leaves an abusive home, because it is going to notify the police that this particular person shouldn't be anywhere near the victim. And what Cassandra was saying, you can get an order of protection without disclosing your address. So people don't have to be worried that they somehow have to give a map to the abuser to come to them.
That's good to know. So I was just alerted that we do have some questions popping up on the chat. So I want to make sure that we are addressing those as well before we move on. So this one was for Jamie. One major challenge with prosecuting domestic battery cases is that the victim will often not cooperate with the victim witness counselors, or they will reconcile with the offender and the office will have to make a decision to prosecute a case without a victim to testify. With all your experience prosecuting domestic violence cases, especially in Kane County, what is your thought on how best to approach the prosecution of domestic battery cases when you are elected as state's attorney?
So that's a great question because this is a difficult situation. In Illinois law, under the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, if a police officer encounters a domestic violence situation and that police officer believes there's credible evidence that domestic violence occurred, that officer is mandated, must make an arrest. And that person then is taken to jail and obviously a case is initiated. At the Kane County State's Attorney's Office, we've always had a no drop policy, and that is something that I would continue at the State's Attorney's Office. And so the no drop policy means that we make the decision, the State's Attorney's Office, to go forward with the charges. Because what we historically saw was that victims were put under a lot of pressure to come in and either ask that the charges be dismissed, lie, or even try to avoid coming to court, which means a warrant could issue for their arrest. So we were putting so much pressure on them by giving them the ability to make the decision, essentially. So we would continue with that no drop policy. But, and this is the most important thing, every victim of domestic violence that comes before the King County State's Attorney's Office will have a voice in the proceeding. That voice is to talk about what they want to see happen, any treatment that they want to see occur, and really listen to what they want. A lot of victims of domestic violence want to stay with the abuser because to them, that's not the abuser. It's their husband, their boyfriend, a girlfriend, a brother, a sister. It's somebody that they love, somebody that they've had a relationship with. And we need to respect that and treat a person respectfully. When I was at the State's Attorney's Office, we created a domestic violence diversion program, which was one of the first that we've had in the state, because the idea was we wanted people, abusers, to take accountability for what they did, get treatment for the issues that are going on, but really giving the victim the voice in that scenario, because we want to make sure that the victim is able to say, this is what I've seen happen, this is what I want to see go forward. We're going to keep the diversion program. We're going to make it even stronger. And we're really going to make sure that the victims are involved as much as they can in this process so that they get justice through this as well.
Thank you. So as we were kind of walking through Cassandra's experience and the topics that we just covered, we know that removing the victim or victims from the setting can be the end of the story and a new beginning for many. Either removing the victim or, like Jamie was just saying, treatment for the abuser could be the end of the story, new beginnings for everyone. However, too often the risk still exists. So Cassandra, can you share about your ongoing concerns after you had left and what steps you took to try to continue to protect your family, what help you reached out for, what reports you were able to make, and the feedback you got in that situation?
So in my direct case, I was gone for exactly a year. I was completely estranged from my husband before the horrific day of September 21st had taken place. But prior to that, reaching out to police, a lot of times in domestic violence, you will see that there's a common trend of patterns where they have criminal activity outside of being violent towards their abuser. That's something that courts should be very aware of. I had moved out and he was facing 3 counts of aggravated felony battery in DuPage County. And even in DuPage, knowing that I had moved out because I was a victim of domestic violence, they still were pushing for me to be a witness to his counts of aggravated felony battery against somebody else, which in my case put me at risk because I had tried to remove myself as much out of that, notifying them that, he still had weapons. That's something a lot of victims can notify the courts when they come forward for the orders of protection, when they follow through on wanting to press charges and getting help and getting safe, is notifying the courts, going to King County, letting them know, you know, he has this amount of guns, he does this. If there's substance abuse issues, I have reported every single possible activity or risk factor towards, you know, the police, towards the court systems, towards he was in the military, towards the military, in hopes that collaboratively they would see that there was a common trend for violence and a cycle that he was cycling through at that point. Even with me removed out of the situation, he was still getting himself into legal trouble. The stalking, you know, I had put video cameras on the front of my house because he would drive past my home. You know, there's a stalking thing, and that's something that I know in Kane and other many counties in Illinois, that is a very, very highly punishable type of behavior. It's actually a felony charge, if I'm correct, Jamie.
You are correct.
Because stalking is something that shows a trend that they are not giving up, nor are they removing themselves out of a very specific situation, and they're showing still too much interest in their victim. And it's also an intimidation factor. If I stalk you, show up, or I stay away from you just far enough, there's nothing that you can do about it unless that order of protection is put into play. But that order of protection is something that is just, and honestly, Jamie, you can admit, it's just a piece of paper. And when you have an abuser who doesn't want to let go, that piece of paper isn't always going to stop them. So throughout this, I had the no contact with the judge from DuPage County. He wasn't supposed to contact me, intimidate me, anything like that. And he still had done that. And September 21st had taken place. But, you know, like I've said before and many times, we have an ankle monitoring system that King County does not use very often, if not very often, for domestic violence. And that is a resource and a tool that other counties that I have gotten involved in since then, they were not using, but now are starting to realize that using that as a tool to help victims, it will help them move forward in wanting to press charges, wanting to have their abusers have accountability, because not only is it just a piece of paper, but now we're giving them something that's going to give them a warning that, okay, your abuser is near you. It gives you enough time to get away from a situation. And that's something, Jamie, you know, with going into a political position and where you have a chance in a court system to make a difference, to be able to use these resources and tools and actually implement them on a more regular basis to protect our victims and to give them more security instead of just a piece of paper that says, we as a court have done our job, now we are not liable if something were to take place to you, because that's really all that it is. And furthering in King County, I hope to see that resource and that tool that we're using that with our victims, because that would have made a difference in my case. That would have kept my children safe. But no one talks about that. No one is putting that to the forefront, that we have all these resources and tools and we're just not implementing them to protect victims outside of it, because that's when they're in the most danger, is when they're out of that situation. So, you know, maybe you can give a little bit more insight as to, if you get into this elected position, you take, will you start to look into using that and helping victims in King County be able to create more safe space and more warning for them?
And Cassandra, you're right. The GPS bracelets, we actually had those in King County, and we were using them when I was the head of the domestic violence unit. And a lot of that came out because of a woman, Miss Bischoff, who had an order of protection, and her husband continued to violate the order of protection until one day he found her and he killed her.
Bischoff's Law.
Bischoff's Law, exactly. And so what happened was they mandated that anyone who violated an order of protection had to have a risk assessment done. But then that mandate went away and it was permissible. So maybe you can have it. For the most part, Kane County was doing risk assessments. We were actually probably one of the few counties that I believe that really worked hard at making sure the risk assessments were done. But it was an unfunded mandate, so we also had to find out how to pay for these GPS bracelets, and we did. Our probation department was fantastic with it. And we had a really great success, and our victims felt safe in the protected areas that they were in because there was a 1,500-foot barrier. And if the offender broke that barrier, an alert went to the police as well as to the victim. But a few years ago, our GPS funding was cut, and we didn't have the GPS or the EHM bracelets. And so I am very pleased to say that our sheriff, Ron Hain, actually brought that back through the jail, because essentially it is cheaper to put somebody on a bracelet than it is to keep them in jail. It makes the victim safe still, no matter what. It makes sure that the abuser hopefully is still working and providing money for that family at some point, but there's a lot that goes into it. When I'm elected, I'm going to make sure that GPS and EHM come back, and I'm going to work with Sheriff Ron Hain, who has endorsed my candidacy because he knows that I am that person who wants to bring safety to our community, and I want to work with victims, and I want to make sure that they are survivors at all times.
Thank you, Jamie. So that was a little bit about Jamie's role, the state's attorney's role in addressing these. There is also some state level legislation that's related to your incident specifically, Cassandra. I know you mentioned the red flag laws, alerting authorities to weapons held by someone who is a known threat or perceived threat. Red flag laws are not something people are very familiar with. It is something that I hope to see more public education on, so that people understand that if they are feeling unsafe around someone who does own weapons and has a FOID card, that they can go to the courts and report that fear. And, people will look at that and address the situation appropriately. So I do hope to see more utilization of the red flag laws. There's also the bill that it was called Fix the FOID. It's now the bio bill, the ban illegal ownership bill, that will be headed to the Senate. And that is legislation that allows for funding for our law enforcement so that they can actually go in and retrieve those weapons. Right now, it's on a good faith basis that if you lose your privilege of having a FOID card, you are asked to come and hand in your weapons. And we know that that is not something that works terribly well for people who don't have good intentions. So that is a bill that I do hope to see pass. And then there's also HB 4262, which is Colton. It created Colton's task force, specifically around what happened to you and to your son, Cassandra. So people who aren't aware of this legislation, what it does, there are 4 parts of it. So the task force conducts a comprehensive review of Illinois' domestic violence laws, makes recommendations to the General Assembly regarding those laws, establishes a framework for specialized protective networks for victims, treatment options for victims and offenders, and last but not least, it reviews the need for special consideration for conditions of bail in cases involving domestic violence within the ongoing changes brought on by bail reform. So these are all really important things. And thank you, Cassandra, for making this really important, bringing it to people's attention. I'm incredibly sorry that, for what happened behind this having to come to light. But I know that it will have a positive effect for a lot more people. And I know that's what you are working so hard for. So all of that said, Cassandra, what is your greatest desire? What is your greatest hope that will come as a result of establishing Colton's task force through this legislation?
It is a bill that it's actually the task force. It's victim driven, which is kind of new for Illinois, especially. It's never been introduced that way, where they're actually going to be survivors that are going to be onto the board, which is going to give us more insight, because I don't care what textbook you read this out of. I don't care how many times that you see this in court, out of court, a political system, a police officer, until you've actually lived it. And I've lost everything because of it, right? My son was murdered violently because my husband had a FOID card that was not revoked, like what we just talked about. He had guns in his possession that were based on just turn them in. And well, why would he do that? Because no one was going to force them to do that. And they're not law-abiding citizens. So entrusting somebody who's a criminal to do that kind of stuff seems very foolish to me. And honestly, it cost my son life. Working with the House bill, like what I want it to do, and honestly, is I want Illinois to have full accountability throughout the whole state. I want from every district to work together, Democratic, Republican, everyone work together to create a safe future for our children and our families. Because at the very root of what we learn and happens in our house is shaping our children to go out into the world and become future voters. They're going into the world to become future lawyers, attorneys, doctors, cashiers, medical professionals. We are literally shaping our future by our children. And when they have to live in a cycle of abuse and our families are not getting the proper protection, we are going to create and continue that cycle of abuse that's going to branch out into other issues that we now are faced with, because it is like a disease, it spreads. And, you know, is it the chicken before the egg or the egg before the chicken? If we can stop this in the homes and create a safer environment and have accountability for abusers to actually suffer consequences, but get necessary help for the victim to become a survivor and the abuser to stop his cycle or her cycle of abuse, we can create a safer place for Illinois. And I think that's honestly, I lost it all. I can't change my story, but what I can do is give strength and a voice to people, for women, children, and men, all equally, no boundaries, that you can survive. There is strength when we stand together, and we all need to work together to create this. It's not something that can be done divided. And that's what I want to do. When I approached the committee and I got it unanimously approved on my son's birthday for my House bill, on his birthday, on his second birthday, I gave it to him in heaven, that I literally said those exact words, that we need to work together. And we need people who are in elected positions to stand forward and say, we will stop this, and we will end the silence, and we will give people voices and work united. And that's ultimately what I want to be done.
Absolutely. I really admire your work.
Thank you.
And I know it can't be easy at all.
Trust me, it's not an easy thing to bury.
No.
Burden that, to bury your son, to have a daughter here that I still have to raise. And I live in Kane now, so this means something to me, because this is my daughter's future here too.
Absolutely.
And I want her to be safe, and I want all of us to be raising people and realize that we are raising future parents and we are raising future spouses. And that's what the difference needs to be. So we can all work together. And I appreciate you guys actually stepping forward and saying, yes, we want to make a difference.
And I think that's something that all of us share in common, is the desire to make a difference and a positive future for kids, because there's nothing more important to me. Jamie, do you have any kind of wrap up on the legal perspective, on the state's attorney perspective, on all of this?
I think Cassandra's right that unless we all work together from every level, we're never going to really make the impact that we need. As anybody who can read about domestic violence knows, that this spans every race, every gender, every socioeconomic status. It can happen to anyone and anywhere. The problem is, for the longest time, we have just kept this silent because sometimes it was the victims themselves who felt embarrassed about the situation. Sometimes it was the threat of violence. Sometimes it was the fear of what would happen to the abuser from the victim's perspective. From my perspective as the next state's attorney, domestic violence is going to be one of those issues that will be on the forefront of what I want to do and how I want to make a difference. I want to make sure that these cases are treated with the seriousness that they are, but I mostly want to make sure that the victims have a voice in this. I know that one of the comments on the page talks about a no drop policy sounding like it stifles the voice of a victim. And I understand how it could sound like that, but that's how the difference between a state's attorney's office who knows how to give a voice without putting all of that pressure on a victim to make a choice. Giving a voice means listening, and we have to do that as prosecutors, because the only way to really do justice in any case is to actually listen to the situation. I can read a police report just like anybody else, but that doesn't mean I have any understanding of what anybody has gone through in this situation, or what, Cassandra, you have gone through. Listening and then doing something in each particular case that's actual justice in that case, that's what we mean when we talk about giving them a voice. Doesn't mean that we want to put any extra pressure on a person in that situation, because they already have the weight of the world on them. One of the greatest things that I like about the House bill that you have helped to put through is the education portion of it. And that education has to go everywhere. I am committing that I'm going to put prosecutors back into our schools so we can talk to kids about domestic violence situations with Mutual Ground and Community Crisis Center, so that we can really be proactive. We're going to go to community meetings and we're going to talk about it. We're going to go to churches or to the disadvantaged individuals who may not know that there are resources or that we're there to help. I'm committed to doing that and to joining you, Cassandra, at police departments, talking to police officers to really show them the face behind what happens and how just one great action from them could change a person's entire life with everything. So thank you for what you have done and your strength in making sure that we move forward in Illinois in regards to this horrible epidemic that still is around. And I don't mean this pandemic, I mean this epidemic of domestic violence. So I look forward to working with you when I am lucky enough to be elected for this community.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for your time tonight. I think this was a really helpful, meaningful conversation. I hope that people out there learned a lot. I certainly did. I learned a lot more about the state's attorney's role in all of this. And I hope that everybody out there has taken some learning from this, that they will continue to share with their families, with their friends, with their neighbors. There's so much that people need to know, and there is no shame in reaching out for help. So please do talk about it, make it honest and open. We can help more people that way. Like Cassandra said, when we work together, we can make a big difference, and we can definitely have better days for our kids. So thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Cassandra. I really enjoyed our time together. Thank you.
Yes, and don't forget to vote. We have early voting now all the way through November 3rd, because your vote is your voice. So get out there and vote.
And an educated vote is a vote that counts.
Yes, absolutely.
Very important for people to know that. And I want to I always end with it, that abuse is abuse, no matter how small. Healthy love is safe love. And if you are in immediate danger, please do not hesitate to call 911. The SAFE plan is something that you can implement, but if you are currently facing immediate danger, please call 911. I think that's very important for people to hear that.
Agreed. We have some fantastic officers in Kane County, so I absolutely.
Well, you ladies take care, and thank you very much for this opportunity for Survivor's Voice to be heard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Take care.